I killed somebody.
You think you killed somebody?
No, I know I did. My sister? I feel so messed up.
Just before midnight on February 4th, 2007, an emergency dispatcher in Abilene, Texas, received a disturbing phone call from a 13-year-old boy named Paris Bennett. Paris told the dispatcher that something terrible had happened inside his family's home. His 4-year-old sister, Ella, had been seriously injured. Then he admitted that he was the person who had attacked her. But the story Paris gave during that call was only the beginning. What initially sounded like the confused confession of a terrified child would soon appear to investigators as something much more calculated. Paris claimed that he had experienced a frightening hallucination. He said he believed his little sister was surrounded by flames and appeared demonic. Investigators, however, would soon uncover evidence suggesting that Paris knew exactly what he was doing. He had convinced the babysitter to leave early. He had waited before calling emergency services. He had spoken to someone else before contacting 911. And, when the dispatcher instructed him to perform CPR, detectives later questioned whether he had genuinely tried to save his sister. Before we continue, subscribe and turn on notifications for more carefully researched stories involving real crimes, unexplained disappearances, and documented mysteries. Also, tell us in the comments where you are watching from tonight. This is the tragic case of Ella Bennett and the investigation into the 13-year-old brother who planned her death. This story involves the murder of a young child. It will be presented respectfully and without unnecessary graphic details. In 2007, Charity Lee was raising 2 children in Abilene, Texas. Her eldest child, Paris, was 10 years old. Her youngest, Ella, was only 4. To people outside the family, Paris appeared exceptionally intelligent, articulate, and mature for his age. Teachers reportedly described him as one of the brightest students they had encountered. Psychological testing conducted around the time of the case reportedly placed his intelligence within an extremely high range. Paris enjoyed reading, writing, and discussing subjects far beyond what many people expected from a child his age. Ella, meanwhile, was described as energetic, affectionate, and full of life. Home videos later shown in documentaries appeared to capture a normal relationship between the siblings. Paris could be seen interacting with Ella, playing with her and behaving like a protective older brother. Nothing in those moments suggested what would eventually happen inside their home. But Charity's personal history was already marked by trauma and violence. When Charity was only 6 years old, her father was murdered in Georgia. Her mother, Kyla Bennett, was accused of arranging the killing but was eventually acquitted by a jury. No conviction was obtained against her. As Charity grew older, she struggled with drug addiction. She later said that becoming pregnant with Paris gave her a reason to rebuild her life and stay alive. For several years, she remained away from drugs. However, during a difficult period before Ella's murder, Charity relapsed into cocaine use. She later acknowledged that her relapse deeply affected Paris. According to Charity, Paris became disappointed and angry after discovering that the mother he trusted had returned to drugs. She would carry enormous guilt about that relapse, wondering whether her actions had contributed to what followed. However, parental addiction alone could not explain the deliberate decisions Paris would eventually make. Countless children experience unstable homes, disappointment, and anger without committing murder. There had also been an earlier warning involving Paris. While the family was staying at Charity's mother's ranch, Paris reportedly became extremely upset following an argument involving Ella. He obtained a kitchen knife and ran outside with it. Concerned about his behavior, Charity admitted him to a psychiatric facility. She later said she was not given the full details of the facility's concerns when Paris was discharged. Only after Ella's death did she reportedly see records describing his fascination with violence and references to homicidal and suicidal thoughts. By then, it was too late. February 4th, 2007 was Super Bowl Sunday. Charity was scheduled to work a busy evening shift at a Buffalo Wild Wings restaurant near Abilene. Because she would be away from home, she arranged for a 21-year-old university student to babysit Paris and Ella. The evening initially appeared normal. According to the babysitter's later account, she took the children to get Chinese food. They returned home and watched an animated version of Alice in Wonderland. Eventually, Ella went to bed. Paris reportedly went to his room, where he appeared to be working on a school assignment about the Trojan War. At approximately 10 o'clock that night, Paris began encouraging the babysitter to leave. The exact words he used have been described differently in various accounts, but investigators concluded that Paris convinced her he was capable of watching Ella until their mother returned. The babysitter eventually agreed and left the house. Paris was now alone with his 4-year-old sister. This became one of the most important moments in the investigation. Had Paris simply wanted to prove that he was mature enough to take care of Ella, or had persuading the babysitter to leave been the first step in a plan? According to investigators, what happened next was not a sudden accident. Paris obtained a knife from the kitchen and entered the bedroom where Ella was sleeping. He attacked his little sister and left her with fatal injuries. Ella appears to have awakened and attempted to protect herself, but she was only 4 years old. By the time the attack ended, there was little chance that emergency responders could save her. Paris did not immediately call 911. Instead, police records indicated that he first contacted a friend. That conversation reportedly lasted for several minutes. Only after ending the call and waiting for a short period did Paris contact emergency services. The delay immediately raised serious questions. Was Paris confused and overwhelmed by what he had done? Was he trying to decide what story he would tell, or was he preparing himself to sound convincing when he finally called for help? When the emergency dispatcher answered, Paris sounded frightened. He reported that his sister had been hurt and admitted that he was responsible. But he quickly offered an explanation. Paris claimed he had experienced a terrifying hallucination. He said he saw Ella as something demonic and believed she was surrounded by flames. According to his first version of events, he had not consciously decided to murder his sister. He had supposedly reacted to something unreal that his mind had created. The dispatcher focused on trying to save Ella. Paris was instructed to remove her from the bed, place her on the floor, and begin chest compressions. He initially appeared reluctant. Eventually, he could be heard counting as though he were following the dispatcher's CPR instructions. To someone listening without knowing what had happened inside the house, Paris might have sounded like a terrified child, desperately trying to save his little sister. But when investigators examined the bedroom, they noticed inconsistencies. Ella's position and the physical evidence in the room caused at least one detective to question whether Paris had genuinely performed chest compressions. Investigators began to suspect that he may have counted aloud without making a meaningful attempt to revive her. That possibility changed the emotional meaning of the 911 call. Instead of a desperate rescue attempt, the counting may have been part of an effort to convince the dispatcher and the police that he was cooperating. Officers arrived at the family's home shortly afterwards. Ella was pronounced dead. Paris was taken into custody. During his first interviews with investigators, Paris continued describing the alleged hallucination. He maintained that he had not fully understood what he was doing when he attacked Ella. Detectives were skeptical. The scene appeared to show purposeful actions before, during, and after the killing. Paris had persuaded the babysitter to leave. He had obtained a weapon. He had entered the room where his sister was sleeping. He had contacted a friend before calling emergency services. And when he finally called 911, his attempt to perform CPR was questioned by the officers who examined the scene. One officer wrote that Paris sometimes appeared to be trying to cry during the interview, but no tears came. That observation could not prove what Paris felt internally, but it contributed to the investigators' doubts about his explanation. The police were no longer trying to determine who had killed Ella. Paris had already admitted causing her death. Instead, they were trying to determine whether he had understood and planned what he had done. That difference was crucial. If Paris had acted during a genuine psychotic episode, the case would involve a seriously disturbed child who had temporarily lost contact with reality. But if the hallucination story was invented, then investigators were dealing with a 13-year-old who had allegedly planned a murder and immediately constructed a false mental health defense. Charity initially wanted to believe her son. She had already lost Ella, but Paris was still her child. Accepting that he had deliberately murdered his sister meant accepting that she had lost both children in a single night. One child had been killed. The other had become the person responsible for the killing. As detectives reconstructed the events of that evening, the evidence increasingly contradicted the idea of a sudden, uncontrollable hallucination. The babysitter's departure appeared deliberate. The conversation Paris had before calling 911 suggested that he was aware enough to communicate after the attack. The delay before the emergency call gave him time to consider what he would do next. The physical evidence also suggested that the attack had continued for a period of time and involved deliberate choices. Investigators recovered additional forensic evidence that raised deeply disturbing questions about what happened in the bedroom. Because Ella was a child, those details do not need to be repeated here. What mattered was the effect the information had on Charity. Weeks after the killing, she reviewed the autopsy findings and investigative reports. She could no longer accept that Paris had simply awakened from a nightmare, lost control, and attacked Ella without understanding his actions. Charity visited Paris at the juvenile detention center and confronted him. She later recalled telling him that she knew the attack had been intentional and that his hallucination story was false. According to Charity, Paris became quiet. Then, his behavior changed. She said he laughed and told her that it had taken her long enough to understand. This account came from Charity and was not a recorded courtroom confession. But for her, the conversation destroyed what little remained of the explanation she had been trying to believe. She became convinced that her son had planned the murder. The question now became almost impossible to answer. Why would a 13-year-old boy murder his 4-year-old sister? Paris would later give several explanations. One involved anger towards Charity because of her relapse into drug use. Paris had once viewed his mother as the person who saved him and cared for him. When she returned to drugs, he reportedly felt betrayed. But instead of attacking Charity directly, Paris chose Ella. According to statements later attributed to him, Paris believed that murdering Ella would cause his mother greater and more lasting pain than killing Charity herself. If Charity died, her suffering would end. But if Ella died, Charity would remain alive and experience the loss for the rest of her life. In writings discussed after the case, Paris reportedly identified another possible motive. He had been curious about watching someone die. These explanations suggested that the killing may have been driven by a combination of resentment, fascination with death, and a desire to punish his mother. But motive is not justification. Charity's relapse may have affected Paris emotionally, but responsibility for Ella's murder belonged to the person who made the decision to attack her. For Charity, however, logic did not remove the guilt. She was Ella's mother, grieving the murder of her daughter. She was also Paris's mother, trying to understand whether she had missed warning signs that could have prevented the crime. No explanation could return Ella to her. Because Paris was only 13 when he committed the murder, his case remained within the Texas juvenile justice system. At the time, he was too young to be transferred and tried in adult criminal court. He was accused of capital murder. In juvenile court, the equivalent of pleading guilty is often described as pleading true to the allegation. Approximately 6 months after Ella's death, Paris admitted responsibility for capital murder. He received a 40-year determinate sentence, the the maximum punishment available through the juvenile proceedings used in his case. The sentence did not mean he would spend the entire 40 years inside a juvenile facility. Texas juvenile institutions could only hold him until a certain age. A later hearing would determine whether he should be released under supervision or transferred into the adult prison system to continue serving the sentence. For Charity, the courtroom presented an unbearable conflict. The prosecution represented justice for Ella. The defense represented Paris, her surviving child. Charity later said that on the day of the sentencing hearing, she did not know which side of the courtroom she should sit on. A chair was reportedly placed for her in the middle aisle. That image captured her position perfectly. She was not simply the mother of a victim. She was not simply the mother of an offender. She was both. Paris's intelligence became a central part of the public discussion surrounding the case. Psychological testing reportedly produced an IQ score of approximately 141. Teachers described his vocabulary and academic abilities as unusually advanced, but intelligence alone did not explain his capacity for violence. Forensic evaluators examined his personality and behavior. Reports discussed narcissistic characteristics, manipulation, limited remorse, and the possibility that he was developing psychopathic traits. However, such language must be handled carefully. The words psychopath and sociopath are commonly used in documentaries and everyday conversations, but neither is a simple formal diagnosis in the way many people assume. Antisocial personality disorder is generally diagnosed in adults, and evaluating psychopathic traits in children remains controversial because a young person's personality and brain are still developing. Some professionals reportedly believed Paris presented a serious long-term risk. Others considered whether developmental or psychiatric conditions might explain certain aspects of his behavior. Charity eventually came to describe her son as a sociopath, although she repeatedly rejected calling him a monster. She believed that describing Paris as a monster would make it too easy for people to dismiss him as something completely separate from ordinary human beings. Paris had not always appeared frightening. He had been intelligent, creative, and capable of appearing loving towards Ella. That was part of what made the case so disturbing. Paris spent the first several years of his sentence inside a youth correctional facility. Records later reviewed by journalists described behavioral problems during that period. These reportedly included violence against another young person, refusal to follow instructions, and attempts to manipulate staff members. Some treatment notes reportedly expressed concern that Paris smiled while discussing Ella's murder. When Paris approached the maximum age for confinement in the juvenile system, a court held a transfer hearing. The judge had to decide whether he should be released under supervision or transferred into an adult prison to serve the remainder of his sentence. Charity supported the transfer. It was one of the most painful decisions she had ever made. She understood the dangers her son could face inside an adult prison, particularly because his victim had been a young child. But she also believed Paris remained dangerous. In September 2012, the court ordered that he be transferred into the adult prison system. Years later, Paris participated in televised interviews from prison. He acknowledged that the hallucination story had not been true and said the killing had been intended to hurt his mother. Viewers debated whether he showed genuine insight and remorse or whether the interviews were another demonstration of his ability to control how other people perceived him. There is no simple test that allows the public to know what another person truly feels. The clearest evidence remains his actions. Paris persuaded the babysitter to leave the house. He attacked Ella. He delayed calling emergency services. He initially offered a false explanation. He later admitted responsibility for capital murder. After Ella's murder, Charity faced intense public judgment. Some people blamed her for leaving the children with a babysitter. Others focused on her history of addiction. Some could not understand why she continued communicating with Paris. But Charity's position did not fit neatly into the categories people expected. Loving her son did not mean excusing his crime Wanting him held accountable did not erase the fact that she had given birth to him, raised him, and remembered the child he had once appeared to be. Charity eventually sought treatment for severe trauma and depression. Over time, she transformed part of her grief into advocacy. She established the Ella Foundation in her daughter's memory. Through that work, Charity supported people affected by violence, including victims' families, relatives of offenders, and children with incarcerated parents. Her message was not that criminal consequences should disappear. It was that violence creates circles of suffering far beyond the immediate crime. Ella lost her life. Charity lost her daughter, and, in another sense, her son. Relatives, friends, teachers, and community members were left questioning whether anything could have prevented the tragedy. Even the babysitter had to live with the knowledge that she had been persuaded to leave shortly before the murder. But the responsibility for what happened did not belong to her. It belonged to Paris. Paris Bennett remains incarcerated within the Texas prison system. His maximum sentence date is February 4, 2047. He is scheduled to become eligible for parole consideration in February 2027, after serving approximately half of his 40-year sentence. Parole eligibility does not mean automatic release. It only means that the relevant authorities may review his behavior, psychological assessments, criminal history, institutional record, and potential risk to the public. The parole board may approve release, delay another review, or deny parole. Charity has publicly expressed fear about what could happen if Paris is eventually released. She has said that, although she loves her son, she does not fully trust him. That statement reveals the emotional contradiction at the center of this case. A mother can love her child and still believe that child may be dangerous. She can forgive without forgetting. She can hope for change while demanding accountability. She can grieve for the daughter who was murdered while continuing to recognize the humanity of the son who committed the murder. The case of Paris Bennett is disturbing, not only because of the age of the killer or the innocence of his victim. It is disturbing because the crime happened inside a family that once appeared ordinary. There was no masked stranger entering through a window. There was no unknown attacker hiding in the darkness. The danger was already inside the home. It was a highly intelligent 13-year-old boy whom Ella trusted as her older brother. The case also raises difficult questions about warning signs. Could the psychiatric concerns identified before the murder have been taken more seriously? Should Charity have received more information after Paris was released from treatment? Could closer supervision or intervention have prevented him from being left alone with Ella? Those questions may never have definite answers. Warning signs are often clearer after a tragedy has already occurred. Beforehand, unusual behavior may be dismissed as anger, rebellion, imagination, or a temporary emotional crisis. Not every child who expresses disturbing thoughts becomes violent, but threats involving weapons, fascination with killing, and references to harming others must always be treated seriously. The case also demonstrates how intelligence can be mistaken for maturity. Paris was academically gifted and spoke with the confidence of someone older than 13. That may have made adults more willing to trust his judgment, but intelligence does not automatically create empathy, emotional stability, or moral responsibility. A child can sound mature while still possessing dangerous impulses that require professional intervention and close supervision. Ella Bennett was only 4 years old. Her life should not be remembered only through the actions of the person who killed her. She was a daughter, a sister, and a child whose future was taken before she had the opportunity to discover who she would become. Charity's advocacy work has attempted to keep Ella's name connected not only to tragedy but also to efforts aimed at preventing violence and supporting families damaged by it. Paris's case will continue to attract public attention as his parole eligibility approaches. Some people believe a crime of this nature demonstrates a permanent danger that cannot be rehabilitated. Others argue that a person who committed a crime at 13 should at least be evaluated for the possibility of genuine change after spending decades in custody. Ultimately, that decision will not be made by documentary viewers or social media commentators. It will be made through the legal parole process, using available records, professional evaluations, and assessments of public safety. But one question will continue to haunt everyone familiar with the case. Can someone who carefully planned such a devastating crime at 13 ever become safe enough to return to society? Or was the murder of Ella Bennett the clearest warning of what Paris was capable of becoming? Share your thoughts respectfully in the comments. Do you believe a person who committed murder at such a young age can ever be genuinely rehabilitated? And do you believe Paris should ever be released? Whatever your opinion, remember that at the center of this story was a 4-year-old girl whose life mattered. Her name was Ella Bennett.